Okay, so it's 3 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining our International Thematic Conference on Phonetic Research and Applications, Phonetics 2025 Hong Kong again on 18th September 2025. So first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Janet Fletcher, a renowned linguist from the University of Melbourne, specializing in phonetic theory, prosodic phonology, and acoustic modeling. Her keynote speech is titled Exploring the Phonetics and Phonology in Tahitian. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fletcher. So I'll pass the time to you now, Professor Fletcher. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just wait for so can everyone see my PowerPoint, I hope?
Yeah, very nice.
Great, terrific. Okay, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to my colleagues for giving me the opportunity to present some of our recent research. So essentially, what I want to talk about today is actually review some of the work that we've been doing on Tahitian, which is an Eastern Polynesian language. But first of all, to sort of give a little bit of a framework for the talk, we know that through the exploration of diverse languages and complex speech sound patterns, we've improved our understanding vastly of phonetic diversity and phonetic topology. But it does seem, and I'm thinking in particular about the languages I've been working on lately, that it's been very hard to find a lot of recent resources on these languages. And it seems that perhaps there's been a tendency to ignore languages with smaller or so-called simple phonological inventories compared to those that are perhaps more unusual and varied compared, in the context of the world's languages and phonetic typology. But of course, we've seen marvelous uplift, I would say, in across the years in people looking more and more at low resource languages. And I would like to point out the recent work that's come out of the Dorico initiative, where very large scale corpora or field data have been analysed in their phonetic context. So thinking now about the corpus I'm going to be talking about today, and I have limited time, so I won't be able to go into huge amounts of detail, but I'm certainly very happy to answer any questions by email or after the talk, whichever is most convenient. But essentially, I'm going to talk about some of the findings from our Tahitian corpus. This corpus was gathered in Papeete, French Polynesia, at the Université de la Polynésie Française just before the pandemic. So lucky us that we got to go there. And the corpus that I'm going to be talking about consists of 2 sentence tasks with controlled lexical materials inserted into 2 separate sentence frames. The first is a variety of disyllabic words that contrast all stops and vowels. And the second task is one where we specifically looked at stress, lexical stress, and very lexical stress location in tokens placed in narrow-focused contexts. We also collected readings of the fable La Bise et le Soleil, the North Wind and the Sun, which for our Tahitian speakers, it made more sense to talk about the southeastern wind and the sun. And we also recorded spontaneous data, but we haven't yet analysed this. We recorded 6 female speakers who are all fluent bilingual speakers of Tahitian and Tahitian French. Now, Tahitian is part of the Eastern Polynesian language family, as I mentioned, and it is spoken in the Eastern Pacific. Now, thinking about the phonological inventory, I should actually back up a bit and mention that it's the dominant Indigenous language of French Polynesia. It has around about 68,000 speakers at the last census. It is, however, undergoing a process of language loss, or should I say the 6 other French Polynesian languages that are spoken in the archipelago have been undergoing severe language loss due to a process of Tahitianization and, of course, prolonged contact with French. It's thought that intergenerational transmission is possibly as low as 23%. So we are really talking about a situation where we're getting generational shift. But essentially, there's been virtually no prior quantitative or experimental phonetic study, but we do have available some descriptions of the phonology available to us. So talking now about the phonology, as you can see, it has a fairly simple in terms of number of phonemes. So we have a single stop series here, labials versus denti-alveolar versus glottal, no voicing contrast. We have a set of vowels, essentially in the typical kind of 5 vowel languages, but with short and vowel long counterparts, and also a series of diphthongs. So we are talking about a fairly small overall phonological inventory. In terms of prominence, this has been discussed in the earlier literature. However, there's been some disagreement about the rules. And in our work, we've been very much influenced by the work of Bickmore, who has probably written the most detailed exploration of main stress in Tahitian. It is essentially a quantity sensitive language. Main stress falls on final syllables if the syllable is heavy, but it is anti-penultimate or penultimate otherwise. And as a general rule, long vowels tend to attract stress unless they're in the vicinity of a final diphthong. And in that case, the final diphthong will have stress. You do also see variable accent placement on words for the short vowels. So I'm just going to play a few of these words for you. So we can see the stress shifts, obviously, in the last word there to follow the long vowel. So our first question then was, looking at the earlier literature, they describe stress, if you will, or word stress as accent d'intensité, so intensity accent, or accent tonique, a tonic accent. So I guess our interest was thinking about the overall post-lexical international typology of the language. So following Sjons' methodology, we wondered if given that we have this sort of earlier description of the language as being a language with a quantity-sensitive stress system, are we going to find that it has more like a head prominence, sort of an Englishy type intonational system where we seek out the main stress syllables of words to locate post-lexical intonational events or pitch accents, or are we going to find patterns more like an edge prominence language? So moving on. Oops, sorry. It seems to be skipping on a bit too far, so I'm terribly sorry. I'll go back. So what do we find? We find that in terms of Tahitian prominence, we do very much find that looking at the international trajectories in one of our specific controlled sentence tasks where we did vary the placement of accent depending on Bickmore's stress rules, that the main pitch event, the main post-lexical international pitch accent does indeed seek out the stressed syllable, the main of the word. If this happens to be in non-final context, so the red signals here, the red panels indicate those post-lexical accents. The blue panels indicate the following unaccented syllables. We find that in phrase medial contexts, we get a penultimate late rising pitch pattern where the peak is timed to the second mora of an accented syllable. But when that word is phrase final, we find an earlier pitch rising pattern. So the peak is timed essentially to the first mora of the accented syllable due to making up room for the following edge tones, for example. We also find prosodic lengthening. Essentially, we have longer accented syllables here in red in both cases. So in the phrase medial or non-prepausal contexts, we certainly have a significant length difference between accented vowels and unaccented vowels. So we get some clear durational contrast, we get clear changes in intensity also, but essentially, because it's a quantity-sensitive language, you're getting a lot of the durational heavy lifting, because we are dealing with the quantity sensitivity of the language. It was not possible to look at de-accentuation in a controlled way in this particular corpus, just because speakers did sort of tend to place each token in narrow focus, even in the sentence context when we tried to control for it. But we certainly have observed patterns of de-accentuation in our fable, or what we call our BES corpus, our Bizet-Soleil corpus. So moving on, our second question. We saw that the stop inventory is very small. We just have the bilabial, the dentialveolar. So we decided we'd have a look at that. There's no voice in contrast, recall. So we were interested to see that given the smallness of the inventory, just two contrasting oral stops, no voice in contrast, would we see different kinds of variation? Now, why is this interesting? Well, for years now, I've looked at First Nations languages in the Australian context, and there's a group of languages that also have a single series stop series. But what we see in those languages is lots of variation in manner of articulation, depending on the context. So I was kind of interested to see what's going on in our data. Will we actually see similar kinds of allophonic variation to other single series languages, either in the Australian context or here? We've got an Algonquian language, Blackfoot, that was analysed by Jenny and Lee, and also closer to home, closer to Tahiti, Hawaiian, Davidson and Parker Jones have also explored this issue. So what we see is absolutely resolutely, particularly in our control task, because this is where the data are from. It's from our very controlled task where we've contrasted all possible stops, vowels, and so forth. They're all voiceless, essentially all voices. There's no evidence of any kind of pre-voicing whatsoever in any of the contexts, either accented, unaccented, initial, or medial. They are very much short lag stops. So in other words, what we're seeing here are very, very short positive voice onset times of between 21 and 25 milliseconds. We do find a little bit of an effect of accent here. So again, the red corresponds to accent in the plot. The U, the unaccented, we've plotted word initial versus word medial stops in this case. So the only one where we really do find an effect of accent is in our alveolus, and indeed the VOT gets shorter, which is something that has been observed, I think, in particular for Blackfoot as well. So rather than longer, which is what you tend to get in languages like English, the effect of accent, the effect of postlexical prominence in this case, is to indeed make it a little bit shorter. We do get segmental effects, however, particularly due to the following vowel, and VOT lag is significantly longer before close vowels, up to 20 milliseconds, but we're still talking about the shorter end of the voice onset time lag continuum. And this very much reflects the results also that were observed for Hawaiian by Davidson and Parker Jones. Now, the rest of the talk, I want to focus on glottal stop variation, which is probably what we've worked on most. And we're rather interested to see then, again, thinking about this whole context of the stop inventory as well being small, but also thinking about the huge amount of work that people have done in recent years, looking very closely at glottal stop, creaky voice, and other sorts of things. And I know many people here in the room who've looked at these, but also I'd like to single out the work of Mark Gorelick and colleagues, and also Christian de Cagno, among many others. So glottal stop is a very important consonant phoneme in Tahitian. It's called the eta. It has a very high text frequency. In Proto-Polynesian, it corresponded to a velar and a velar nasal. So these are no longer present in modern Tahitian, although certain loanwords, the velar plosive does show up, but it hasn't got a particularly high text frequency. Glottal stop can occur initially, medially, in stressed and unstressed syllable onsets. And there are also many minimal pairs where we find an initial glottal stop versus no glottal stop. They never occur word finally because essentially Tahitian has a fairly simple syllable structure, an open syllable structure, so there are no closed syllables. Now, looking back at the literature and the impressionistic descriptions, people talk about that, well, they don't agree essentially about what's going on. It ranges from there's no positional variation, that is, all glottal stops are voiceless in spoken Tahitian, or there's highly unpredictable variation. One thing that the authors do agree on is that there is co-articulation with surrounding vowels in words, particularly in those vowels that follow a glottal stop. So relevant, I think, very relevant to this is a little bit of a background. People talk quite often about the so-called continuum model of glottal stop production, where glottal stops can have realizations ranging from a creaky voice vowel to a fully occluded variant. So-called true glottal stops with full glottal closure are more likely to be found in word or phrase initial versus medial positions. So there's a sense in which you get a degree of prosodic strengthening or gestural strengthening in prosodically salient contexts. But in terms of just general variants, it seems that studies of other Polynesian languages, and particular Hawaiian, these studies suggest high levels of variation, ranging from canonical voiceless glottal stops through to creaky voiced stops, so the so-called, fitting along the continuum, but they even note breathy voiced stops, or variants, should I say, and modal variants. So by the time we're getting into the breathy voiced and also the modal variants, we're kind of getting into the more vocalic territory as well. So lenition, essentially, I suspect, is going on when we see such variation. So just to play you a couple of examples of glottal stops from our corpus, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the data that went into the quantitative analysis that I'll present in the next slide. But just to kind of tune your ears in. Okay, so this was a word that cropped up rather a lot in our fable corpus, in our Bizesule corpus for the southeast wind. And what we've got here on the left is an example of what Davidson has called the full glottal closure variant, and we certainly see that here looking at the speech waveform and the spectrogram. So we see a period of voicelessness, usually around 40 to 50% of voicelessness, but with some glottal pulses either side. Now, the second variant we've analysed as creaky voice, kind of hard sometimes because our speakers sometimes have quite a natural breathy voice anyway, but usually the creaky voice ones show up quite clearly. We can see the aperiodic striations going through the spectrogram here. And so this sort of allowed us then to, by looking across our corpus, we wanted to have a look at the distribution of different kinds of glottal variants following the protocols established by Lisa Davidson for Hawaiian. So we looked for evidence of full closure variants, creaky variants, breathy or modal voiced variants. And this is what we came up with. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the two tasks we looked at here. The two tasks we looked at were the controlled tasks that we looked at for the stops, okay, but we also looked at our fable task, our Bizesule corpus. Now, if you focus just on the plots, here we've got the different kinds of variants plotted according to word position, so initial and medial, across the two tasks, just for ease of presentation. So we had across the corpus, this part of the corpus, around 2,263 glottal stops, and we found 4 main variants: a breathy voice variant, a creaky voice variant, a full closure variant, and modal voice. But by far, you can see by looking at the aqua bars in our bar charts and the green bars, the main variants were in fact full closure and creaky voice. And in fact, the modal variants were highly predictable because these either occurred at the beginning of particles or were in certain lexical items where flunking identical vowels. Okay, so there are some very, very specific lexical items where these modal variants occurred. But for the most part, we found 2 pretty consonantal variants, I would say, full closure and creaky voice. By creaky voice, essentially, what was absolutely striking to us was that it really resembled very much the aperiodic creak rather than the kind of vocal fry creak, which is a much more sort of vowel type creak that people like Pat Keating talk about. But what we did also find was word position was really important. So we saw more canonical glottal stops in word initial position or accented syllable onsets versus medial position. We ran particularly the two main variants, we ran that through a binomial logistic regression model, and it came up as highly significant. So we see more creaky voice variants and medial unaccented syllables. So we're assuming these are kind of our more lenited variants, given those prosodic contexts. And another sort of fact that was really interesting to us, that we actually saw a higher percentage of full closure variants compared to the corpus analysed by Davidson et al. Of course, we're looking at a very controlled sentence task and also a red task, whereas the data set that Davidson and Parker Jones have analysed was a corpus of radio interviews from the 70s. So that the genre differences are probably responsible here. I won't have time to go through all of the various acoustic measures that we looked at, but I did want to show some. We looked at some of the measures in particular that were adopted by Mark Gorelick and colleagues in their huge 131 language survey of glottal stop variation and other voice quality variation, moreover. So what we see here is strength of excitation. Here we see voicing fraction, which is the first one, and that's taken from the Pratt voice report. So essentially a lower degree of voicing or lower values of voicing equals less periodicity. We also looked at an intensity measure, again, a source measure looking at voicing intensity. So lower values equals less energy. So we used voice source in MATLAB. And we've recently also been using Pratt source for this. And finally, we extracted a spectral measure corrected for vowel sorry, I seem to have lost my. Apologies for that. There's always something, isn't there? So just picking up where I left off. Acoustic measures. Okay, so voiced fraction first. So we just decided to focus on the two main variants. Okay, here. So we've got the full closure variants on the left, the creaky voice variants on the right. Now the red here corresponds to the experimental task. So the red corresponds to the red speech or the connected speech fable task, the Bizet-Soleil. The blue bars correspond to a very controlled sentence frame task. The left panel in both cases is accented, the right panel unaccented, the top panel initial, the bottom panel medial. Well, just looking and comparing the two variants, it becomes obvious that there's a clear difference in a voicing fraction looking at the full closure variants, which albeit had a few glottal pulsations, okay, so that's why we're getting some signal being registered, compared to the creaky voice variants where we see much more voicing fraction, particularly in the Bizet-Soleil task, so in the connected red task. So we found that glottal variant was highly significant, so lower degrees of voicing fraction in the full closure variants, as one might expect, higher degrees of voicing fraction in creaky voice variants. We found effects of prominence, and this was largely carried by unaccented syllables in medial position, essentially often having more voicing fraction. Initials tended to, particularly in our Bez task, had lower degrees compared to the medials, and so on and so forth. So essentially, again, higher voicing fraction here, meaning more periodicity, more creaky voice variance. So this seemed quite significant. Our intensity measure now, here we're looking just to change the color scheme to keep everyone awake. Here we have our purple bars now representing our Bizet-Soleil data, our yellow bars, the more controlled sentence frame data. And what we see, just glancing at the plots from left to right, they're arranged in exactly the same way. We get much higher levels of intensity in the creaky voice variants as we would expect. So essentially they're noisier. The creaky variants are noisier, particularly in the Bizet-Soleil task. We also have a small effect of position, okay, in that we tend to get a bit more variation in medial position, but task was clearly the main indicator. So glottal variant and task were by far the strongest factors that affected our intensity levels. Now, the last measure I'm going to share with you today, because I'm already running out of time, is spectral tilt. And here we're not actually looking at the glottal variants themselves, we're looking at the vowels either side. And these were submitted to a GAMS analysis. But what I'm showing you here are the loose smooth signals, because I think it kind of makes it easier to see what's going on. So what we're looking at are vowels flanking glottal or oral stops. Okay, so the consonants are in the middle. You're looking at vowels that are preceding, vowels are following. In word initials, of course, there's no vowels preceding, and medials, there are vowels preceding, vowels following, and so on. So I'd like you just to note the fishtail pattern that's going on either side of the consonant here. And we see quite lower. So the solid line here represents our glottal stops, the dotted line, our oral stops that have been collapsed for this analysis. So we see lower spectral tilt values corrected for vowels leading in and out of our glottal stop. So this suggests, yes, we do have a degree of glottal co-articulation as you would expect in the neighbouring vowels, which was predicted by those who have described glottal stops in the Tahitian literature to date. We also see effects of position, effects of experiment, effects of glottal type, and very small effects of prominence. Again, what we find is that the lowest spectral tilt values, remembering that low spectral tilt means higher levels of vocal fold constriction, so more creaky voice. We find this particularly in the medial unaccented vowels after a glottal stop, where we see more extensive creaky voice. So we're kind of seeing that very, very neatly here in this bottom right panel. So, in sum, yes, there is a degree of cross-linguistic similarity, thinking about what people have said about glottal stop variation across languages. We do get variation. We get evidence of full stop realizations. We get evidence of creaky voice realizations. To a certain extent, we're seeing some evidence of prosodic strengthening, particularly in accented initial context, particularly in our sentence frame task, but also we're seeing a lot of elenition in our medial unaccented context in the B's task, in the Bizet-Soleil task. We have a lower percent of creaky voice variance compared to Hawaiian, but we are dealing with a different language, a very different language context situation, and a very different genre. But it is also, we see lower degrees of creaky voice than have been observed in languages like Arapaho, which has been analysed by De Canio and colleagues. I would argue that certainly from what I've seen across our corpus, we have more consonantal, I would argue, rather than vocalic realizations. And even among those that we classified as creaky voice, you're getting more that look like aperiodic voice or prototypical creak with no periodicity or very intermittent periodicity compared to the vocal fry or tense voice, where we do get F0 being derived and so on. So the more sort of vowel end. We do see co-articulation also, particularly in our unaccented medial syllables. And of course, I've collapsed everything across our 6 speakers, and we do see a degree of interspeaker variation. But for the most part, there is some particular agreement in terms of the proportion of full stops realised compared to quickie voice variants, just slight differences in degree. So I just wanted to finish by saying that there's a lot of value in exploring low resource languages. Just because a language has a relatively simple phonological inventory doesn't preclude really interesting variation in the fine phonetic detail. And small languages do complicated things too. And I'd also like to signal that I really do think it's important for us to consider prosody and genre in phonetic typology. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my colleague Adele Gregory and also the research assistants Ben Volchok and Eleanor Lewis who made this presentation possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for Professor Fletcher's inspiring talk. Yeah, let's give her another round of applause. So I'll now pass the time to Alex. So yeah, and to see whether there are any questions from the floor. Thanks.
Yeah, does anyone have questions for Janet?
Oh, hello, Magdalena.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I just wanted to thank you for your wonderful talk. I really enjoy it. And I have a question regarding the short lag of T in stressed syllables. This is something counterintuitive, something that we don't find in other languages. How would you explain this?
Well, thank you, Magdalena. Yes, I think it was interesting that my colleagues who worked on Hawaiian found something similar. And it's also been found in Blackfoot. And I think in a kind of way, it's just going, it's a strengthening effect, essentially. But I know that seems perverse to those of us that have worked on many other languages where we expect a lengthening. So we get longer closure, but we get shorter. And I think the thing is too, what's so interesting about these stops, I didn't have time to talk about them, is that there's often a glottal closure that's associated with them as well. So I suspect this is what's going on.
This is what I would assume. Maybe we see a kind of process from T to a glottal stop, and this would be a perfect example of a strengthening process, right?
I think that's right. And we see it in Marquesan also, which still has a velar, but the release is very glottalized. So I think, and it's other varieties have lost the velar entirely. So you can see this progress that's been going on through the languages.
Extremely interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you so much, Janet. It was a lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
One moment. Maybe I could ask Janet,
of course. Yes.
A small comment question. Thank you. I really enjoy your talk. And I remembered some experiments in Sweden a few years ago about the length. Swedish has substantial vowel lengths, short, long, and a little bit quality differences. But what we show, and I enjoy your analysis, Mora, which I think is not only a phonological thing, it is phonetic as well, because what we show in Swedish, with modern analysis, we could see a lot, and not the old one, we couldn't see anything, was that the long vowels were two different things. One vowel here, something in between, and then another vowel when we had expansion. And tonal movements respected this boundary.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yes, I must
phonetic,
look into that.
not only phonological.
Thank you.
And then we should probably have a look, what is the difference between two vowels, like in Greek, and then a long vowel with two muras. What is the realization?
Very good. That's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Maybe the long vowels is simply 2 vowels.
Indeed. Well, yes, yes, I think I better not start because I don't know. But yes, I think there's been some controversy in some of the other Eastern Polynesian languages, Marquesan, where that has indeed been a suggestion there.
And then it would be very interesting to have a look what is happening in the stressed syllabes and then in the unstressed syllabes.
Indeed.
How is the ratio if we have length distinction in unstressed syllable? What is the ratio? I mean,
yeah, no, and we certainly have those data, and we can certainly look at that. So thank you. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you again for the invitation. Thank you.
With this mode, so originally I was registered for linguistic conference, so probably my today's presentation won't be the most interesting one for all of you, but I will focus on methodological issues related with investigating humor, mostly self-irony, self-directed speech. And here you can see an overview of my presentation. I will start with the foundation of my project and investigation. So I will tell something about self-reported scales, which are commonly used in psycholinguistic to investigate humor and in general everything. Then I will try to answer how we can better investigate the things that we actually want to investigate, because sometimes self-report scales won't tell us about an actual use of particular language statements and humor. So to begin with, as I said, I will start with self-reported scales, and it seems to be intuitive to ask people about their experiences, but we face some challenges with self-report data, which are commonly used in psycholinguistic, and I will refer to the 4 horsemen, as I said, because we have 4 different issues related with using self-reported scale. Firstly, it's social desirability bias, where responses may reflect what we think is expected rather than our authentic selves. Then we have recall bias, which makes it challenging to accurately remember those spontaneous, self-depreciating humor moments, because we sometimes are not even capable to recall a particular examples of using humor in our life. And then a lack of self-awareness, which is also one of the most complex part in psycholinguistic, because most of our humor moments happens automatically without even us even realizing this. Then acquiescence bias, which introduces a tendency to agree too quickly when we have to answer on the scale. I will show you one of the examples that we have in dual self-report humor scale, which is commonly used to investigate self-directed humor. And these biases may complicate our understanding of the communication process. To truly uncover actually the essence of self-irony or general communicational styles, we need to look beyond what people say and focus on how they genuinely engage during communication process. So here, as I said, you will see one of the examples of the questionnaires, which is used to investigate self-directed humor. And this is a typical question that researchers use actually to measure self-directed humor. We may ask someone to rate their agreement with a statement like this: I often try to make people like or accept me more by saying something funny about my own weaknesses, blunders, or faults. And responders would then use a scale to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement with the statement. This question was designed to capture the social function of self-irony or self-directed humor, because we have many different terms which are used interchangeably. And usually self-depreciating humor is a strategy of fostering social connections or increasing likability, and it seeks to explore the underlying intentions behind such statements. However, this is precisely where biases can come into play. Would individuals, for instance, feel comfortable admitting that they strategically employ self-depreciation to gain acceptance, especially if they believe it may be interpreted negatively as a sign of insecurity or sometimes even manipulation? Alternatively, may they select disagree to present themselves in a more the more acceptable self-image? Then, when people encounter the statement that I presented, I may make fun of my weaknesses to be liked, a subconscious filter often activates. Admitting this can feel risky, as it may come across as insecurity or desperate need for approval. Consequently, even someone who frequently uses self-depreciating humor may select disagree to maintain an image of confidence. However, this is a very interesting flip side to this. Some individuals may strongly agree with the statement because they perceive this behavior as a positive social skill, being relatable, being humble, and they may overlook the potential self-defeating aspect of this. In both scenarios, the response is not solely about the behavior itself. It also concerns how that behavior is perceived by others and also by the individuals themselves, our participants of the study. Then recall bias. The key word here in the statement is often. How accurately we can track how often we use self-irony. I sometimes even struggle to recall what I've eaten today. These behaviors are rarely planned. They happen quickly in a conversation, they are usually habitual, and this may lead to two different types of errors. A person may remember one or two times a self-depreciating joke was perfect and overestimate the use of this strategy, and on the other hand, they may forget the dozen small, unconscious comments they made at themselves just this week and underestimate this. Our memories are not the exact records, they are rather highlight reels. We often rely on a fault memory, and the data that we obtain from this becomes unreliable. Okay, and then we have the third bias that may appear while using self-reported scales is lack of self-awareness. And the question that we have does not only just ask if you use self-irony, but why? To accept people like or to make people like me or accept me more. Many self-ironic speakers are not consciously aware of that specific motivation. They may truly believe they are just being funny or keeping it real. The need for acceptance is so ingrained and automatic that it occurs below conscious awareness. So they may honestly answer disagree because of this blind spot. They act while sincerely denying the conscious reason. This gap between their behavior and their conscious motive is what makes self-irony a very fascinating topic for psycholinguistic research, but also may arise some problems with obtaining reliable data. Then we have agreement bias. And this is a tendency to take the path of resistance. When confronted with a statement, some individuals often want to agree because it's our nature to agree with with the questionnaires. Usually, when we have this on the scale, and self-depreciating humor is in general perceived as a socially acceptable form of humor. There are even research suggesting that people who use self-directed humor are perceived as more intelligent. So most of us probably would want to be perceived as more intelligent, that we give this image for other people. And as a result, even if a statement does not perfectly align with the habits that we have, it can feel easier or more agreeable for participants to select somewhat agree rather than actively disagreeing. This creates a challenge. Factors like social desirability, fault memory, blind spots, and our natural inclination to agree can lead to unreliable survey responses. And to truly understand someone who speaks self-ironically, we cannot depend only on this distorted reflection. We need to look beyond the words and focus on what they reveal through genuine conversation, or if it's too time consuming because analyzing conversations takes a lot of time, we need to create some different tasks that will be more reliable. So this is the beginning of our exploration, and I will show you two different methods that I investigated in my project to capture self-irony and manage time also and costs. So probably researchers will select a method that will align with the aims of the study, but self-reported case may not be the best one. So since we have explored the challenges of asking people directly about their habits, we've seen how biases such as social desirability, recall issues, lack of self-awareness, and tendency to agree can distort self-report data. Now, how we can actually overcome these biases? How we can encourage more authentic expressions? So I developed two different methods. The first one is easier to be applied. It's a cartoon self-reflection task. It's indirect method, so I won't ask people about the perception, but encourage them to give an accurate or more genuine responses for particular situations. And this task, the pressure is off because participants were not directly reporting on themselves. Instead, they were imagining that they are a character in a similar situations, which were common for most of us. I checked this in the pilot study, and they have to send a text to a friend about the situation. And this approach creates a safe distance, allowing more spontaneous, more honest responses than these that we obtain from the scales. And as you can see on the here, I presented some of the comments that I received. I have 500 responses for this study, so I selected the most common ones because some of them were repetitive. And as you can see, comments like business on top, party on the bottom is a classic example of self-irony, non-prototypical one. The speaker playfully admits a minor flaw, using humor to connect with others and show that don't take themselves too seriously. It's a socially savvy move. On the other hand, the last option that is presented here, I am so bad at being professional, is different. It represents direct, heavy self-criticism that can feel less strategic. Tasks like this, like the cartoon task, may reveal our communication style, but it's not, of course, the best way of investigating communication. But sometimes when we have to manage time and costs, probably it would be better than using questionnaires, because it shows how we instinctively manage our image through humor, often without even realizing we are doing this. And here we have another example, because in this task I had several situations. In this scenario, people were asked to imagine that they walk into a room, but as soon as you cross the threshold, the reason that you entered completely vanishes from the mind. It's a very common situation that happens to all of us. So the situations were easy to be applied in our particular experiences. And then I asked people how they would comment on their focus or memory. And this question isn't about rating memory on a scale, rather it's about inviting participants to generate responses that they are probably will be sharing with a friend. The first response that you see offers a vivid and self-ironic descriptions. My focus and memory are currently playing hide and seek with me, and memory is winning by a landslide. It's like my brain hit the reset button the moment I crossed the threshold. And this response, as you can see, employs personification, hyperbole to acknowledge a relatable cognitive lapse humorously. It is a self-depreciating, but maintains a light-hearted tone, capturing a shared experience. And for instance, the third one takes a different tone. Oh God, what is really wrong with me right now? This statement directly expresses frustration and anxiety, lacking any humor. It reflects a moment of genuine concern or distress rather than an attempt to comment playfully on one's own fallibility. So by encouraging participants to create their own responses, we can observe how individuals choose to frame their experiences. Do they embrace self-ironic humor to soften the impact of perceived shortcomings, or do they want to express frustration in the comments? Okay, and then okay, I had a problem with a computer, but now it's okay. And then I implemented also and compared with between the talk show task. I asked people in this exercise, I asked people to imagine that they are TV co-presenters hosting a live talk show with a partner. I recorded this and analyzed paralinguistic cues and gestures because it's important in capturing self-irony, since we not always give the information about being self-ironic in verbal part of our speech. So the task was related with speaking about 6 different topics. They selected these topics so they could relate with them better, and they had to speak for approximately 5 minutes on a given one. The goal was to make presentation engaging, enjoyable for the audience, and no one of the researchers were in the room where participants were talking together, because I wanted to give them possibility to speak as freely as they can, so the ecological validity of the task will be provided. So why is it important to the study? So this approach actually shifts the focus from abstract questions or written reflections, as we had in the previous task, to actual performance of communication in a simulated live settings like this. And it's useful in studying low-frequency phenomena like self-irony. We can observe how speakers naturally engage their audience, build rapport, and crucially for my research, how they may use humor, storytelling, and even self-irony, because I didn't include this in the instruction, to connect with others and express their identity or actual communication style in real time. This task enabled me to collect more richer, more behavior-based data about authentic communication, because we usually communicate with someone else. We don't solely give response for the questionnaires or for the topics. So one of the examples I decided to show you on this presentation was about National Health Fund in Poland, and the presenters had to discuss, make discussion along this phrase, jak chorować to tylko na NFZ, which can be translated as choose National Health Fund for your health, or more colloquially, if you're getting to be sick, make sure it's through the public system. And this is not just a random subject, because NFZ in Poland is, let's say, related with a lot of different experiences. Usually they are not the best ones, so it carries an ironic undertone. So it implies that even through the public system, if it's a viable option, it comes with a range of associated challenges. And it's related with, for instance, long wait times, bureaucracy, red tape, limited access to specialists, an underfunded system, and varying quality service, even when we think about different regions in Poland. So these experiences are deeply relatable for most of my participants, and even when I studied this with international students, they have a common experience as Polish people with NFZ. So that topic can also be humorous, so elicit humorous responses. It presents an opportunity for personal stories as required by the talk show task, and discussing these topics can easily invite irony or self-irony, in general humor, both as a critique of the system and as a means of self-reflection. And this approach could help me to engage participants in exploring their narrations about past experiences and share also a common ground with another interlocutor. And I decided to show you two different conversational dyads or the responses. Here on the right side, you can see translation, and on the left side, you will see an original text in Polish. So in the first dyad, the speaker describes the chaotic waiting room and the strategy for navigating it. A key moment occurs when the speaker says, "That's how I pushed my way in. I mean, I didn't push, I just slipped through." In the actual recording, the phrase "I mean" serves as a classic example of conversational repair. It is accompanied by subtle cues such as quick, light laugh, and shift to a more conspirational tone, or even we can say dismissive because of the hand gesture. The paralinguistic wing is when the speaker is signaling, "Don't take my confession too seriously," and we won't be able to capture that without the visual part of our study. I saw a hand of Axel, so I ran out of the time.
I'm checking to see how we can communicate that there's very little time left.
Okay, so I will stop with this example and just continue with this conversation, a part of the conversation. So in this dyad, the partner reads the signal perfectly, and paralinguistic wing serves as an invitation, with the partner immediately accepts. The co-host escalates the joke about pato influencers, as you can see in this example. So there is a sense of a shift in the atmosphere. The conversation is then related with a fantasy story about how we can improve our national health system, and probably, as they found out, it would be recording how people behave while waiting in a line and get a reward and money for other people watching how they fight for their place in this line during, for instance, a hospital visit or before the hospital visit. Okay, so I will stop right now. So
I'll go ahead and try to make this very quickly. Basically, it's more of an announcement more than anything else, because I'm presenting a pipeline. And I'm presenting a pipeline that was developed by my student, Rundhui, who I supervised in the master's program for language technology at Uppsala University. So if anyone has any questions, I recommend that you reach out to her. And I strongly recommend generally that you let her do things, because she's a very, very good student, and she has done some excellent work in the, should we say, a gray area between phonetics and computational modeling and deep learning. Essentially, we have a program that lets us predict formants. You have a vocal tract imagined as this kind of linear acoustic resonator, correct? This is the formula. I won't spend too much time on the mathematical side of this, but basically you put in an arbitrary shape defined by its segments and the length and the area of those segments, and it predicts a vowel quality. Some very old computational work. that we are implementing in a modern sense. You can imagine the lips are on one end, the glottis are on the other end. Here you see a speaker, which is me, saying ooh. The slide is gone, for fuck's sake, man. I don't know why it stops. Okay, it looks like it's back. You'll see a scan of a human adult, which is me. You see the same shape converted into a vocal tract segment shape, or a vocal tract segment sequence, and you see the predicted vowel quality, each peak being a formant. And it predicts very accurately that this is an oo, predicts 2 lower frequency formants. Now, what the pipeline does, it lets us look at specifically how does changing any one segment contribute to changes in each formant. So the pipeline lets us generate tens of thousands of random configurations, varying only the areas of each segment, and analyze the relationship between the changes to the segment and to each formant. So we're looking at what happens to the output, to the formants, when you change the area of these segments based on tens of thousands of data points. So here you see an A. You can verify that by seeing the formants are A appropriate. And the results lets us look at, I won't get too much into how to read these. These are SHAP values. It's a standard value in machine learning, a standard measurement in machine learning. But generally, when there is red, it means that the area is larger. When there is blue, it means that the area is smaller. So you can see that for this is the first formant for all tubes. And you'll see that the first formant generally has this sort of downward trajectory, especially focused on these the front areas. It also lets us look at specifically one single configuration, right? Because when you have these, when you have lots and lots of data, you can actually look up close at any one configuration, and you can see, well, what does each segment contribute to the vowel quality output? So here you have the F1 and the F2 for A, and you see which segments are making those changes from schwa to A, so to A, and you see, let's see there, you'll see that the biggest changes are in A13, 15, 16. So these are the numbered segments. 16 is at the very bottom, that's at the glottis. 1 is at the very front, and you'll see that for both F1 and F2, even though they're in different direction, F2 is shifted down, F1 is shifted up, but you'll see that the main causes of that is kind of centered around this part of the tract. And you can do this for any vowel quality. For any one configuration, you can present it in this exact way. So what the pipeline does, it lets us analyze the contribution of each segment in a tube vocal tract model to each formant in the predicted output. That said, there are, of course, a lot of interactions between parts of the tract, and the current iteration of the pipeline does not take this into account. So you can imagine that, for example, when this part is narrow, but this part is open, there's going to be a unique kind of relationship that we just cannot see in the way this is presented so far. But that's something that we're planning on doing in future iterations of this pipeline. So if you're interested in this type of work, the preprint is out now. And I again urge that everyone gives all the appropriate credit to Runway, who has done most of the heavy lifting here. The reason she is not presenting is because the university would not cover her presentation fees for this specifically. So thank you. I've tried to keep this very short so that we can kind of get back to the main program. So I'm going to stop sharing here. If anyone is interested, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me. Next person on the schedule is the presentation HRTs and the first and second generation Mandarin and Anglo-background speakers in Australia.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Chen Jin. You can call me Taylor. I'm a postgraduate student from Australian National University, and this is part of my honors project supervised by Ksenia. So, firstly, I'll introduce the background of intonation in migrant communities. So, recently, there are distinct linguistic varieties emerging in migrant communities, which is known as ethnolects. So for the first generation of migration, their first language substrate influence shapes the second language speech. And for the second generation, who are either born in the migration country or migrant before 5 years old and live in a second language speaking households, their speech may either remain their parents' L1 features or sounds more like native norm. So Hoff and Walker suggest two main vowels for the generation 2 speech. The strong interpretation assumes they sound more like generation 1 because of the language transfer, while the weak predicts they may sound like native norms or develop their own style. Many work focuses on the linguistic change in lexicon, syntactic, and phonetics, while prosody, especially intonation, remains understudied in ethnolinguistic identity. So the study will focus on one of the marked intonational feature, high-rising terminals, HRTs. So HRTs have unusual rising terminals in declarative modality, and they have been found in different English varieties. So the example of HRT in declarative utterance up the very top on the left-hand side with the rising pitch contour at the end on the side. And I'll play an audio example from an Australian English speaker.
So at one stage they bought a milk bar together and that was their first business.
Mm-hmm. And that was their first business is an example of HRT. So HRTs have varied a lot across different English varieties. In Australian English, they start on the nuclear syllable and rise sharply over 40%. In London, sorry. Sorry, I can't hear you clearly. Okay, I'll continue. In London and Southern California, the rise is smaller. Okay, so the higher rates of HRTs are found in younger and female speakers, and the rates are also varied in different ethnicity. For example, in New Zealand English, minority ethnic group spread HRTs into mainstream English, while in places like Sydney and London, minority ethnic groups show convergence toward Anglos. So the research gaps are remained in HRT usage in contemporary Australian English and in ethnic groups. So today we'll explore what is the HRT pattern in Anglo-Celtic generation 1 and 2 Mandarin background Australians in terms of their frequency and phonetic realization. Okay, so for this study, I draw on 3 corpora of sociolinguistic interviews with 8 female participants in each group, including Anglo-Celtic Australians who are native English speakers, generation 2 Mandarin background Australians who are native English speakers from Mandarin-speaking households, and the generation 1 Mandarin background Australians who are native Mandarin speakers, arrived after age of 17 and have lived in Australia for more than 5 years. Okay, so for the coding, I first coded all the declarative intonation units I use for all corpora. Then I used both auditory and acoustic coding for HRTs. So I first coded all the IUs with definitely HRT, definitely not HRTs, and not sure. For the not sure cases, will be blind coded by 2 linguists, and their disagreements were resolved by measuring pitch excursion, with rise greater than 40% classified as HRT. And all the quantitative results were using logistic mixed effects models. Okay. In addition, I conducted a preliminary acoustic analysis based on 10 random samples from each group, focusing on pitch, excursion, and rise alignment. Okay. The result of HRT frequency showed that in over 7,000 declarative intonation units, there are almost 24% HRTs identified. So among the 3 groups, Anglo showed the lowest HRT frequency at around 20%, and Generation 2 showed the highest frequency at around 30%, and even Generation 1 is higher than Anglo but lower than Generation 2. And for the statistical analysis results, only Generation 2 is significantly higher than Anglo. Well, since age has shown do not have interactive effect with participant group, it has pruned in the model. Okay, so for the pitch excursion, Generation 2 are lower than Anglo, while Generation 1 is are higher than Anglo. And in terms of rise alignment, we have pretty good alignment of the data. These are the screenshots of pitch contours, which shown as blue lines on the figures and taken from each group in plot. So we can see that the rise onset of 3 groups start on the first vowel of the nuclear syllable, that is the last stressed syllable. Okay. I'll first discuss HRTs in mainstream Australian English. So among Anglo-Celtic speakers, HRT frequency shows a steady generational rise, reaching nearly 20% for those who were born in the 1980s to 90s. And this rate is also higher than other English varieties, for example, New Zealand English and London English. Well, phonetically, HRTs show larger pitch excursions and consistent rise alignment. Therefore, we conclude that HRTs in Australian English can be described as occurring at high rates with large excursion and stable alignment. Compared to Anglo speakers, the frequency of HRT is significantly higher with similar phonetic properties. So this mainstream-like structure with higher rates indicates a higher ethnic orientation toward mainstream communities. And it also different from Aboriginal Australians and Asian and Black British speakers with smaller rates compared to Anglos. This results indicates that Generation 2 Mandarin background Australians are ahead in change in Australian English norms with higher HRT frequency. Well, whether the Generation 2 pattern is from Generation 1 is unknown. So in the next section, I'll discuss HRTs in L2 speakers. Okay, so the use of HRT among Generation 1 speakers reflect the acquisition of a sociolinguistic variable, not L1 transfer, because L1 Mandarin speakers have been found that underuse rising tones in long English sentences. So the higher rates and similar rise alignment indicate the strong social alignment because they've adapted well to local patterns. And the larger excursion may be an indicator of influence from Mandarin, but the existing evidence is very limited. Well, the last question remains, are differences between Anglo and Generation 2 explained by differences between Anglo and Generation 1? Well, answer is not. The findings of Anglo and Gen 1 further support the weak interpretation of athletes. That is, the use of HRT in generation 1 and 2 show the similar acoustic properties to Anglo speakers and do not reflect L1 transfer. Okay. So in conclusion, HRT is a socially meaningful variable, and high frequency of HRT in Mandarin background Australians might lead the change in Australian English. Overall, HRT serves as a lens into how prosody evolves in multilingual and post-migration contexts. So future studies could broaden sample size and scope with male speakers and larger sample size, and could also focus on acoustic and pragmatic analysis. Okay. Thank you for listening.
Correlates.
So, my name is Amal Issa. I am affiliated to the University of Garian, and this research was conducted while I was at the University of Leeds. And today's research is about Geminates in Libyan Arabic, and we have investigated the articulatory correlates. This is an outline of the study. So first of all, I will introduce the topic and explain the motivations behind this research. Next, I will briefly explain the methodology used in this study, presenting the stimuli and data collection methods. And after that, I will speak or outline the results, which are mainly focused on the amount of contact, the center of gravity, and the tongue shape or visual observation. After that, I will briefly discuss and conclude the topic. So, Geminates are typically contrastive in many languages of the world, as you already know, and these are typically distinguished from singletons by longer duration. However, non-durational articulatory cues to Geminates has been explored for many languages, such as Italian and Japanese and other languages, but findings show that there are some systematic differences in the tongue configuration and in the contact pattern as well to those Geminates. However, such articulatory correlates remain largely unexplored for Arabic, and despite the language extensive use of gemination. And this study addresses this gap by examining the articulatory realizations of singleton and geminate consonants in Libyan Arabic. And the methodology, so the stimuli, the language variety used in the study is Tripolitanian Libyan Arabic. It is an Arabic variety spoken in the northern African region in Libya and mainly in the western part of the country. The sonorant sounds used in this study are the alveolar la, na, and ra. And the stimuli contained trisyllabic minimal or near minimal word pairs. And they all were placed or targeted in an intervocalic median position. Data collection means I have used the electropalattography EBG with the WIN EBG system from Articulate instrument, and the Articulate assistant software was used to analyze the data. Measurements in this study targeted the alveolar region area, which was defined as the rows from 1 to 3. And here we can see picture and a diagram of the the articulate style palette to the right that was used, and the EBG frame to the left, which shows here a complete closure in the alveolar region area. indicating full contact. Yeah. Going to the results. The amount of contact values were analyzed using ANOVA. And these were measured at the mid-frame and also at the frame with the maximum electrode activation. Results show systematic differences between the singleton and geminate consonants. And also, Geminates are found to show significantly greater linguopalatal contact and longer articulatory duration. These graphs show the amount of contact at the maximum frame to the left and at the middle frame to the right, and it clearly show a larger, longer amount of contact in Geminates compared to singletons and the three sounds tested in this study. So, as regarding the result center of gravity, these also were analyzed. The values for these center of gravity measurements were analyzed using ANOVA. Again, these were tested at the mid frame and the maximum frame, or the frame with the maximum electrode activation. And in the middle frame, the center of gravity values for singletons were found to be significantly higher than geminates. The center of gravity values at the frame with the maximum electrode activation also found to be significantly higher than in singletons, higher than those in geminates. And sorry, and the implications of this, or what this can tell us, is that the geminate consonants are produced with a more posterior tongue configuration with consistent laminal articulation, compared to singletons, which have more anterior contact associated with an apical gesture. These graphs show the results for the center of gravity measurements, targeting both the maximum, the frame with the maximum contact to the left, and the frame with the middle contact measured here. We have also conducted visual inspection to the frames to test and see the electrode activation throughout the frames. And the visual inspection further support this distinction between singleton and geminate consonants, revealing firmer and broader constriction pattern for geminates. It also demonstrates that geminates in Tripolitanian Libyan Arabics are not merely, or the distinction is not merely temporal, but also involves articulatory restructuring. For example, we can see these two frames illustrating the palatograms of the singleton and geminate consonant for the sound la. And as you can see, with the geminate contact in the first three rows, showing that the alveolar region electrodes show more contact than you can see in the singleton consonant frame. The numbers here indicate the percentage of contact throughout the duration of the articulation. Yeah, you can also see here the results for the alveolar nasal sound. These are the palatograms of the singleton and geminates. It is clearly that the amount and region of contact for geminates is more than that of a singleton. These are the results for the or the palatograms of the singleton and geminate sound ra. And again, the contact in the geminate consonant extends to the third row, where it is solely restricted to the first row in the case of a singleton. Discussion and conclusion. So to conclude the topic or the research findings, this study provides the first articulately analysis of gemination in Libyan Arabic dialect, and it contributes new empirical data to the broader typology of geminate consonants. The results also support the view that geminates or gemination entails both temporal and spatial enhancements in articulatory gestures, suggesting a strengthening effect on the articulatory level, which was found in studies by Keating 2003, Joe and Keating 2001, Onaka 2003, and Fogueran and Keating 1997. These findings have implications for model of phonological representation and articulatory planning in geminate production. This was the study, and this was the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive any questions.
Thank you very much. Nice to see some speech production work as well. Nice to get the whole picture. And I say that as a totally unbiased production person myself. Whenever you want. The presentation is prosodic prominence does not facilitate word identification. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hello from Germany. This is a psycholinguistic study on the processing of prosodic prominence that was conducted with my former PhD student, Barbara Zeyer. As you certainly all know, speakers can draw attention to particular words within an utterance by making them prosodically prominent. And prosodic prominence is defined as the highlighting of a linguistic element in its environment by making use of prosodic characteristics so that this element stands out prosodically from its environment. And pitch accents are one means to express prosodic prominence. And according to a study on German by Baumann and Röhr, high-pitched accents are perceived as prominent by adult speakers of German, while de-accentuation, that is the lack of an accent where an accent is expected, is perceived as least prosodically prominent. The aim of our study was to investigate whether and how prosodic prominence influences online language processing. And psycholinguistic studies have consistently found that prosodically prominent target words are remembered and recalled better in word recall tasks. And these studies indicate that prosodic prominence leads to a better anchoring of prosodically prominently presented words in memory. In contrast to this very consistently found effect of prosodic prominence on word recall, the effects of prosodic prominence on other online aspects of language processing, especially on lexical access and word identification, are less clear-cut. So there are two studies that made use of a word monitoring task to investigate whether prosodic prominence influences lexical access and word identification. And in a word monitoring test, participants have to listen to sentences and they have to push a response button as soon as they identify a previously defined target word. And while there's an older study of Cutler and Sweeney that reports that prosodically more prominent target words were identified faster than unstressed ones, we in our own research could not replicate this effect in a word monitoring task for speakers of German. So we wanted to get more evidence on the issue, whether or not prosodic prominence exerts an online influence on language processing that is specifically on lexical access and word identification. And we therefore adopted a different online experimental paradigm that also targets these processes, and that is auditory lexical decision. And in an auditory lexical decision task, participants hear words or non-words, and they have to decide as quickly as possible whether they heard a word or not. And we assumed that if prosodic prominence affected lexical access and auditory word identification, then lexical decision times for words that are presented with a prosodically prominent pitch accent should be faster compared to reaction times to words that are de-accented and thus not prosodically prominent. In this experiment, we tested 50 real words in total, and these words were bisyllabic trochaic German adverbials, and they were recorded with both a prominent pitch accent and with de-accentuation. An example for a word would be morgens, meaning in the morning. 2 experimental lists were created, and participants heard each real word only in one of the 2 prominence conditions. And the speaker recording these stimuli was a trained phonetician and a native speaker of Standard German. And in addition, each experimental list also contained 50 non-words that were derived from the test words by exchanging 1 or 2 phonemes. An example here would be Torgens, a non-word, and these non-words were also presented either with a high pitch accent or with de-accentuation. Words and non-words were presented in a previously randomized but fixed order, and please note that in a lexical decision task, we only analyze reactions to words, not to non-words. Here you see the time normalized F0 contours of the presented words in the 2 experimental prosodic conditions, the pitch accent condition on the top and the de-accentuation condition below. And we tested 50 adult participants that all grew up with German as their only language up to the age of 6 years, and they all had normal hearing. Real words and non-words were presented via headphones to the participants, and each word or non-word was preceded by an attentional signal, a beep sound, and after each item, participants had to decide as quickly as possible by pushing a yes or no button on a button box whether what they had just heard was a real word of German or not. And We measured and analyzed reaction times to correct yes, a word responses, and reaction times were measured from the onset of the presented word up to the participant's reaction. Here's the data. In total, we analyzed 2,411 reactions, and the figure here shows the distribution of the obtained reaction times and also the mean reaction time for the two experimental conditions: words presented with a prominent, high-pitch accent and words presented with de-accentuation. And as you see, the distribution as well as the means are very similar in both conditions. And in fact, statistical analysis with a linear mixed effects model did not yield any significant difference between the reaction times in the two experimental conditions. And also the effect size, the D here, the D value, indicates no effect for the prosodic manipulation on reaction times. Thus, the manipulation of prosodic prominence did not influence the reaction times in this lexical decision task. So our data indicate that prosodic prominence did not influence lexical access in our lexical decision task. Reaction times to words presented with a prosodically prominent pitch accent were not faster than reaction times to words presented in the non-prominent de-accentuation condition. And this finding conforms to our previous research, to the word monitoring task I mentioned in the beginning, where we also could not find an effect of prosodic prominence on lexical access and word identification. Thus, there seems to be a discrepancy. On the one hand, prosodic prominence clearly influences word recall, where it leads to a better anchoring in memory of prominent elements, while on the other hand, prosodic prominence does not influence lexical access and word identification, and at least it seems so. So how can we account for these different effects of prosodic prominence on word recall on the one hand side and on lexical access and word identification on the other side? So we want to suggest here that it is not prosodic prominence per se that affects language processing, but that it rather is the information status prosodic prominence expresses. And this information status exerts the influence on processing. In psycholinguistic studies that have found an effect of prosodic prominence, such as these word recall studies, prosodic prominence typically expressed contrastive information by high-pitched accents. And in contrast, in the lexical decision task presented here, and also in our previous word monitoring task, in those tasks where we found no effects of prosodic prominence on language processing, the prosodic manipulations in the experiment carried no information structural content, and specifically they did not mark any contrastive information. So to sum up, the results of the lexical decision task reported here and the previously conducted word monitoring task conform in their finding that prosodic prominence does not facilitate the process of lexical access and word identification in online processing. Rather, it is likely that being prosodically prominent alone is not sufficient to affect these early stages of language processing. It seems to us that for prosodic prominence to facilitate language processing, it also has to fulfill its function of signaling information status, specifically here contrast. And thus prosodic prominence should only affect stages in language processing where this information structural content that is expressed by prosodic prominence is of relevance. And whether this assumption holds, of course, has to be addressed in future research. And with this, I thank you for your attention. try to stop this. Yeah.
Very nice. Are there any questions in the audience? Otherwise, I might have one.
Yeah, of course.
I'll just wait. I'll deprioritize my own questions if there's anyone else. Okay, nothing. So I was it's always interesting to me when there is an idea in the literature before and then you kind of revisit it and you say we couldn't replicate this effect. So like, do you know why? Like, what was it in the earlier studies that made them find this that was then ruled out by you later? Like, what's the difference? Is it just noise, or is there like a systematic reason, you think?
Yeah, that's of course is the issue. So when we started this earlier word monitoring study, this replication of Cutler and Swinney 87, we expected to find the same effect. Of course, we expected to find it, but we couldn't. It really was a null result, and this data was already published as a null result. So we were quite sure that the effect wasn't there. And of course, the issue is why couldn't we replicate this effect? In fact, I have to say, we don't have any idea. So it seems we used the same paradigm. Of course, there were some modifications. We used German, not English. Of course, we had much more participants. We had much more sentences than in the original study. I think they just had 16 participants and 12 sentences, I think. So the database was quite small. So it might be that it was just a noise, but in fact, we discussed some of these of potential solutions that were addressed to us by reviewers when we published this paper on the word monitoring task. But yeah, I have to say, I think we could rule out these differences. Cutler and Swinney used, for instance, prepositions that were marked by an accent, and we used adverbials. But yeah, this is basically one of the differences. But I don't know how this can account for the finding.
No, it seems a bit like a stretch. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. Very nice.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So the presentation is entitled Arabic Phonological Transfer in English, Stress Assignment Patterns and Pedagogical Implications. Feel free to start whenever you want.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon here in Hong Kong, and good morning or evening to those joining from other time zones. Thank you for being here. My talk is on phonological transfer and instructional interventions in Arab learners' English lexical stress acquisition. I'll show how Arabic influences stress learning in English and how targeting instruction can help. Let me begin with the problem this study addresses. Next slide, please. Arab learners often struggle with English stress, which affects intelligibility and prosodic naturalness. Yet, stress has received less attention than segmental phonology in both research and teaching. This makes evidence-based interventions necessary. To see why, let's briefly compare English and Arabic stress systems. Next, please. So it's slide 3 now. English stress is shaped by syllable weight, morphology, and affixation. Arabic, by contrast, is more predictable. It stresses the rightmost heavy syllable within 3 from the end. English also allows derived stress shifts, but Arabic doesn't. And this creates some challenges for Arab learners. Against this background, here is where the research gap lies. So it's slide 4, please. Most prior work is descriptive, focusing on segmentals. Very few experimental studies have tested interventions with Arab learners. So the present study will try this problem. Then this leads directly to our research questions. Slide 5, please. I asked 4 questions. How do stress patterns affect performance? What error types are most frequent? How effective are interventions? And last, is there any perception production link? To answer these questions, let's look at the participants. So it's slide 6, please, participants. I worked with 180 secondary level Arab EFL learners balanced by gender and proficiency. They were assigned to 3 groups. The CPA group, the contrastive phonological analysis group, the ADT, the auditory discrimination training group, and a control group following the regular curriculum. The study was grounded in 3 theoretical models. Next slide, please, slide 7. So I drew on the following 3 frameworks. The prosodic transfer hypothesis, which predicts L1 influence on L2 prosody. The speech learning model, which emphasizes perceptual constraints, and the perceptual assimilation model for second language learning, PALM L2, which explains how L2 sounds map into L1 categories. These guided the mixed methods design in the current study. I'll now turn to the methodology. Slide 8, please. I used a 50-item test recorded in RP accent under sound booth conditions. Reliability was strong. Cronbach's alpha was 0.84. For perception, learners circled stressed syllables. For production, they read items aloud in isolation. I just need to add that the items covered 5 stress patterns, 10 items each. We have initial stress, anti-penultimate stress, penultimate stress, final stress, and stress-derived shifts. Next slide, please. Alongside this, I conducted acoustic analysis. So I measured pitch, vowel duration, and intensity in Pratt. The inter-rated reliability was very high, with Cohen's kappa equal to 0.96. Let me now outline the 2 instructional interventions. So slide 10, please. The first intervention was the contrastive phonological analysis intervention. And this intervention emphasized contrastive analysis of Arabic and English stress rules, practice with suffix-based stress shifts, and metalinguistic awareness tasks. The second intervention, next slide, please, slide 11. The second intervention was the auditory discrimination training intervention. And this intervention involved listening and repetition, minimal pair contrasts, and moving from perception to guided production. Here is the procedure I followed. Next slide, slide 12, please. I began with a pre-test, followed by 10 weeks of instruction. Immediately after instruction, I conducted a post-test, and then 8 weeks later, a delayed post-test to measure retention. The data was analyzed both quantitatively and qualitatively. Next slide, slide 13, please. So quantitative data was analyzed with repeated measures ANOVAs, and correlations. Interviews were thematically analyzed and findings triangulated for validity. I'll move to the results. Slide 14, please. Research question number 1 concerned accuracy. Accuracy was highest for initial, then penultimate, and final stress. Anti-penultimate and derived stress shift were lowest, reflecting difficulty where Arabic and English diverge. Now let's look at the results of the second research question, which concerned error patterns. Slide 15, please. Errors clustered in derived stress shift and anti-penultimate patterns. Stress was more often misplaced than not identified, showing L1 rule transfer. Production errors exceeded perception errors, especially on complex items. Now, what about the instructional effects? Slide 16, please. Research question number 3 concerned the intervention effects. Both the contrastive phonological analysis and the auditory discrimination training interventions improved performance, but the CPA, the contrastive phonological analysis, produced larger and more durable gains. The contrastive phonological analysis, again, was especially effective for the derived stress shifts. Acoustic data confirmed more native-like pitch, duration, and intensity after instruction, especially in the contrastive phonological analysis group. I also examined the link between perception and production, which was the focus of research question number 4. Slide 17, please. Perception gains strongly correlated with production gains, supporting models that link perception to production accuracy. Now, let me bring these findings together in the discussion. Slide 18, please. The results confirm strong L1 transfer. Patterns aligned with Arabic were easiest, while the absent ones, like the anti-penultimate and the derived stress shift patterns, caused systematic errors. Production was harder than perception, with overgeneralization of L1 rules, especially in morphologically complex forms. Instruction worked, but the contrastive phonological analysis group outperformed the auditory discrimination training group, particularly with the derived stress shift patterns. Of course, there were some limitations. The next slide, please, slide number 19. Derived stress shift patterns remained difficult. Neither the contrastive phonological analysis nor the auditory discrimination training methods fully addressed the intervention of morphology and stress. Future teaching should integrate morphological awareness. This, of course, points to future research directions. Slide number 20. So future studies should test long-term retention, use factorial designs to isolate instructional components, and include more instructional measures of production. What are the key takeaways? Slide number 21, please. Key takeaways include the following. L1 transfer strongly affects stress acquisition. Both the CPA, the contrastive phonological analysis, and the ADT, auditory discrimination training instructional interventions helped, but the contrastive phonological analysis intervention was best for complex patterns. A perception production link highlighted the value of auditory training. Now, what are the pedagogical implications? Slide number 22. Instruction should contrast Arabic and English stress explicitly. Use auditory training with tools like PRAT and scaffold from simple to complex patterns within communicative tasks. I'll finish here. Thank you for your attention. I would be glad to take your questions or hear any further comments. Thanks a lot.
The next presentation is Benjamin Schmeiser on a gestural approach to Latin, cluster realization in Galego-Portuguese and Sardinian. Benjamin, are you Ben, maybe?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start my talk now. The title of my talk is A Gestural Approach to Latin. I'm going to be looking at the onset clusters of PL, FL, and KL and restricting my talk just to that really in onset position. With 10 minutes or around that, I think that's the best way to go. And I'm looking at it in two languages, Galego-Portuguese, which I'm considering actually just one family because they behave the same way in this particular environment, and then Sardinian. So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all, whatever is relevant to you. And I appreciate, again, giving me this time to talk about the topic. Okay, just a very quick introduction that I'll give with regard to the languages. And then I'm going to dive right into talking about Latin. So this is a historical paper, a historical study that I've been working on with primarily Galego-Portuguese, but then I started to see it occur in Sardinian as well. So I wanted to include that. I'll give you some definitions of onset clusters in Latin, and then I'll talk about word transmission over time. And then we'll take a look at how it plays out in a few different Romance languages. I'll show you how it's unique in this talk today, and then I'll give a little bit of theoretical analysis and some conclusions. Okay, so Romance languages, of course, are languages whose mother is Latin, languages that come from Latin. I've listed a few actually for you, and it's really just to show you how many there are. Most linguists agree that there are at least 14, and oftentimes they talk about the big five, but there are actually many languages that come from Latin. I will be focusing in on Galician or Gallego and Portuguese, and then, of course, Sardinian. So let's take a look at some visuals on that. You can see on the map here, this would be the Iberian Peninsula, the western part, and this is Portugal here. And then, so I'll be calling it GP for the rest of the way. You can also hear it called Galego-Portuguese or Galician Portuguese. And again, they are slightly different languages now. They became separate languages around the 13th century, but they do behave the same way in this area. And then, of course, I'll be taking a look at Sardinian. Sardinian is an island off the coast of Italy. The island is Sardinia, excuse me, and there they speak Sardinian. This might be controversial, but it is not technically a dialect of Italian. It is technically its own language. It's known for being quite conservative, actually, in sound change from Latin. What I want you to take a look at here is I've got all the different possibilities for onset cluster layouts for Latin. And so on the left, you can see that I've got the consonant plus R, and then on the right, consonant plus L. So I'll be looking at, in blue, the P, T, and F areas here. And an example would be plano, clamare, and flamma. So again, blue is what we're looking at today. And essentially what goes on here is when you have different types of word transmissions, that's going to be a signal. It's not 100%, but it really helps us understand what's going on here as far as the way the words are phonologically processed. Over time, popular words are usually oral transmissions, and they typically, quote unquote, as I like to say, do what they want us to do, right? Or what we want them to do, better said. Meaning, if I gave you a list of all the different phonological processes and I gave you a word, you'd be able to predict the outcome based on the fact that it does exactly what we think it will do. Semi-learned words are oftentimes through written transmission. They may undergo a slight minor change here or there, so they're kind of a middle ground. That's actually relevant for today's talk. And then learned words are usually words that are through written transmission, for example, like the Bible, you know, as a religious context, and they typically undergo either no change or the change is not predictable. So again, popular, semi-learned, and learned. Okay, so let's take a look here. If you look at a word like ecclesia coming from Latin, in Catalan you can see it goes església, in French église, Italian chiesa, and then in Portuguese and in Sardinian, see how it goes from the CL or well the KL combination to an R. So now we have rhoticization here with Portuguese igreja, Galician igreja, and Sardinian Crecia or Crecia, depending on the region. Either way, the important point is that it goes from an L to an R in only these two languages of the at least 14 from Latin. I'll quickly just note here, I'm gonna hone in on the PL, so my examples on the A and B. I want you to really focus on these because this is an example of a popular word. If I gave you a PL word in Latin, plaga, you would predict, if it went through all the changes that we think, that we would get shaga. So PL would go to the fricative. Now in B, if you notice though, I'm going to skip over. If I gave you a PL word, you would also expect it to change, but some words don't. The learned words actually stay. So planta from Latin is actually not planta, or even shanta. Here it actually just stays planta. So that's the learned word. Here's the popular word, and then here's in the middle. This middle point here is, notice it goes from PL to PR, prato. So again, I've got more examples, but I just wanted to give you one to really show you the different transmissions. Okay, so quickly here, Jensen 1999 points out, you can see under Latin, if I've got PL and FL and GL, in Galego-Portuguese, GP, you will see that the fricative again occur almost always. And then over on this side here, you've got maybe a BR combination, but again, you're looking at more of the fricative realization here. Possibly even over here for the CL in the middle. All right, so let's take a look at some examples here. If I gave you, for GP, if I gave you plata, again, you would actually assume it'd be chata, but it doesn't, and it doesn't go to plata either, but rather it switches to prato. With the R. Same way with flacus. If I gave you flacus, it goes to fracu. Ecclesia goes to igreja or igreja, as I said earlier. Now, Sardinian does the same thing. If I give you a PL here, you could have plus, but you actually get prus. The FL combination from flama gives you fiamma, which would be more of the expected popular result, or frada, which is a variant, and again, it has the rhotic. Latin KL goes to ecclesia, goes to crecia, and again, you can see here R, 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 R across the board for all different ones from the PL, FL, and KL onset clusters. So in short, what we're taking a look at here is the obstruent plus rhotic onset clusters really don't do anything differently. They just go through unaffected or nothing. Everything is predictable. The problem here is when it happens when we have the lateral or approximate, the L in the cluster itself. These two languages, again, are quite rare in the sense that only 2 out of the 14 actually have this process. In this paper, in this study today, I'm tying this idea to what type of word transmission, which would be a semicultismo or a semi-learned word. In terms of theoretical aspects, I just want to focus in on articulatory phonology, and I'm going to skip around just a little bit, just because of time. And I want to focus in on Gaffos's notion of a syllable, and then also Bird's 1994 and 96 the notion of a phase window. So let me just show you, these are 2 gestures, and I just want to point to the fact that a phase window here is actually used for popular words, and then it's also for the semi-learned words in a different way. So if I take a phase window, here's an example of a consonant cluster without one, and then there's a consonant cluster with a phase window, and that's what we're going to focus on. So for the current analysis, essentially what we have is 2 gestures overlapping within this phase window, right? And in Gaffos's terms, a C2 target, the second consonant, aligns with C's 1 release. So what we get is less distance between the 2 consonants is allowed because the lateral is markedly different in its articulatory realization. Laterals, so L's, involve an additional gesture whereby the sides of the tongue are lowered as to allow for lateral air release. And taps lack this additional gesture, and we have a shorter realization, a very rapid movement. And so in GP and Sardinian, essentially this is what we have, right? What we have is a timing restriction in the phase window in which C2's onset aligns with C1's C center. This is relevant because it connects how the word was brought into the language by illustrating modifications in the timing within the language itself as a consequent effect on the evolution. This explanation is particularly advantageous to the analysis because it can distinguish popular words from words that were learned and semi-learned. Essentially, popular words were passed on orally and underwent the predictable phonological changes that I mentioned. However, the languages analyzed in the current study permitted the liquid as the second member of the cluster in semi-learned and learned words. We saw the example earlier of planta going on to staying planta and not going to pranta. In this case, it's deemed a learned word precisely because the timing pattern is from Latin and not from the timing relationship in the new languages, GP and Sardinian. There's a copy of that, and I thank you for your time.
All right, very nice, thank you. Are there any questions in the audience? Anything that has cropped up? Nothing in the chat. I have been a little short on the comments to presenters, so or questions to presenters. So in general, I think it's okay if you kind of go beyond those 10 minutes. Okay. It's sort of been the pattern that has been established.
Yeah, I'm at 12. If I can, then let me just on this part.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Yeah, but that's what I'd like to talk about. I mean, when I say in this case here, I'm not referring to planta actually. When I say in this case, I'm referring to the study itself. A semi-learned word or a learned word will be precisely the timing pattern from Latin itself. So that's why we do get something like planta, or the semi-learned word, which would be prato, where the L goes to an R. Other than that, and then just quickly, if I do have one more minute, I'll take it. I wanted to, if this had been a 20 or 30 minute, I would have included, in the case of Sardinian also, you do see this phonologically in coda position with heterosyllabic, consonant clusters. So like if you look at the word altum, it will go to artu, so the L goes to an R, but because it's in coda position, later on, as the language forms, the R drops out, and so the modern form would be ATTU, or something along the lines of ATU. So it does affect also in the heterosyllabic context as well, but because of time, of course, I focused on the tautosyllabic environment.
No, that makes sense. Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. Of course, if any questions crop up later, I'm sure you're more than welcome to send Ben a message and all of that as usual. And I encourage you to do so. We're doing pretty well schedule-wise. We're just a few minutes behind now. But we'll go ahead. We have 2 more presentations. I've seen the remaining speakers in the chat. So this presentation is the pitch relationship and phonation cues in native and non-native listeners' Mandarin tone perception. You're welcome to start whenever you want. Thank you.
Right. My name is Okjuli, and I'm going to be presenting part of our work. This work was done by Dr. Kyungmin Lee and myself. All right, this is a table of contents. I'm going to start with introduction and research goals, and I'm going to talk about the methodology and results, and wrap up with discussion and conclusion. As many of you may know, Mandarin has 4 tones: high, rising, low, or dipping, and falling. Among these tones, tone 3 is most often realized as a low pitch because of the tone Sandy rule in Mandarin. For identifying these tones, the pitch height and movements are the primary cues. But not only the intrinsic pitch properties of target syllables are crucial, but the contextual pitch information coming from neighboring syllables plays an important role in Mandarin tone perception. In particular, the pitch relation between target syllable and adjacent syllable greatly influences tone identification. So for instance, the same pitch height may be identified as low tone when it's followed by high pitch, whereas it can be identified as high tone when it's followed by a low pitch because of contrastive effects. Along with pitch, phonation is also used in tone languages. For instance, in Mandarin, tone 3, which is low tone, is often produced with creaky voice. And in Cantonese, tone 4, which is low falling tone, is associated with creaky voice. So the research goals, we wanted to examine how phonetic properties, which are not intrinsic to the pitch of target tones, interact in native and non-native listeners' perception of Mandarin tone 1 and tone 3, so high and low tones. So they are distinguished primarily by pitch height. And we wanted to focus on the roles of the pitch relations between the syllables in disyllabic context and phonation types in the target tone. And we wanted to also look at the listeners' language experience effects, especially their L1 and Mandarin L2 proficiency. So we had these specific research questions that we wanted to provide answers to. So the first one is we wanted to know how pitch relation cues and phonation cues influence the perception. And the pitch relation cues include the size and direction of pitch differences between the syllables. So you can see 4 combination conditions coming from pitch relation and phonation cues. And we also wanted to look at the effect of L1 backgrounds of the listeners and also L2 Mandarin proficiency. So we conducted a Mandarin tone identification experiment with 140 participants from 5 groups: native Mandarin listeners and Cantonese and Korean listeners with low and high L2 Mandarin proficiency. We actually chose Cantonese and Korean because Cantonese uses both pitch and phonation for lexical tones. By contrast, Korean uses neither for lexical distinction. So we constructed 3 sets of segmentally identical tone 1 plus tone 2 sequence or tone 3 plus tone 2 sequence, as you can see in the table. And each set had one of the plosive onsets followed by a high, mid, or low nuclear vowel. We recorded native speakers, 2 native speakers, 1 male and 1 female. We manipulated the pitch on syllable 1. Syllable 1 is the target syllable that we were interested in looking at. So we manipulated the pitch on syllable 1 along an 11-level continuum within the speaker's pitch range. Afterwards, we excluded the middle pitch because we wanted to make sure that syllable 1 was either higher or lower than the initial pitch of syllable 2. The initial pitch on syllable 2 was fixed at the midpoint of the pitch range in order to avoid contrastive effects. So we had these two pitch relation conditions. So the syllable 1 was lower or higher than syllable 2. And then we synthesized voice quality on syllable 1. So syllable 1 was either modal voice or creaky. In total, we had 360 stimuli for the experiments. And we had these 5 listener groups: Mandarin, Cantonese high, Cantonese low, Korean high, Korean low. Here, high and low meaning high L2 Mandarin proficiency, low L2 Mandarin proficiency. And we conducted this experiment online, and participants were asked to select what they heard from the given pair that we have shown on the screen. So they were basically asked to judge whether what they heard was tone 1, tone 2, or tone 3 and tone 2 sequence. So we analyzed their tone identification responses, and our main interests were listener groups and direction of pitch differences and magnitude of pitch differences, as well as phonation types on the target syllable. So here are the results. We found that listener groups and direction and magnitude of pitch differences and phonation types on the target syllable all had significant effects on their tone identification. In particular, pitch relation cues were the most influential factors, again confirming that the pitch on the target syllable and the contextual pitch properties are the most crucial cues for identifying tones in Mandarin. So for instance, in the condition where we have lower syllable 1 than syllable 2, then they had more tone 3 responses. And when there was creaky voice on syllable 1, then we had more tone 3 identification on the target syllable as well. When we looked at the categorical perception between tone 1 and tone 3, again, high and low tones, then we saw very strong categorical perception for all the groups except for Korean low listeners. So the larger the pitch difference, the more tone responses. This is basically the patterns that we found. But also we found that the boundary differences were also notable. So the tone 1 category is broader for Korean listeners, whereas tone 3 category is broader for Cantonese listeners, as you can see in the picture. We also found phonation effects for all 5 groups. So for all 5 groups, creaky voice notably enhances tone 3 perception. And it's very interesting that this creaky voice effect is greater for the Korean listeners. Again, Korean doesn't use creaky voice for lexical distinction. All right, let's look at the effects of language experience on the QUs. First, I'm going to be talking about language experience effects on the pitch relation cues. So we have two pitch relation conditions here. Overall, Korean listeners have greater tone one identification responses than Mandarin listeners. And Cantonese listeners, they had more tone three identification. And low proficiency Korean listeners have relatively weaker tone three perception in both pitch relation conditions, as you can see in the picture. So the gray lines correspond to Korean listeners, and red line is for the native Mandarin listeners, and the blue lines are for Cantonese listeners. What about the language experience effects on the phonation cues? So we have these modal and creaky voice conditions, and it was very interesting that native tone language listeners, including native Mandarin and native Cantonese listeners, they show actually little change in perception across phonation types. It suggests that they rely more heavily on pitch cues than on phonation cues. However, Korean listeners, they use creaky voice a lot, especially Korean high listeners. They make extensive use of creaky voice as an important cue for low tone perception. And Korean low listeners, they have hard time. They have difficulty with perceiving low tone, even when the pitch relation cue favors tone three identification. When we look at the combination of these two types of cues, then as I highlighted in the green box here, this is a condition where we have lower syllable one and modal voice. Then Mandarin listeners show significantly higher tone three identification. This indicates native listeners' stable pitch relation cues for the low tone perception. However, when we brought in the creaky voice here, then Korean high listeners, they demonstrated tone three perception at a level comparable to native Mandarin listeners. So again, it shows that Korean high listeners, they use creaky voice a lot, even more than the native speakers. And the third condition, we have higher syllable one and modal voice. So with the pitch relation cue favoring tone one perception, Korean listeners show the highest tone one identification as indicated in the figure. The last condition, in this condition, tone one should be less favored because syllable one is higher than the following one. However, when creaky voice was available, tone one identification among Korean listeners significantly decreased. But interestingly, there is a contrast between Korean listeners and Cantonese listeners, because despite the pitch relation favoring tone one perception, Cantonese listeners, they still consistently show the highest tone three, highest low tone identification in both phonation conditions. So to wrap up, this is the conclusion. We examined the roles of pitch relations between syllables and phonation cues, which are not intrinsic to the target tones. And then we found that both native and non-native listeners actually use these non-intrinsic cues. So they use both pitch relation and phonation cues. And for all those groups, pitch relation cues were more important. However, phonation cues were so significant. And we found significant effects of language experience. So L1 background and L2 proficiency level notably influence listeners' use of those cues. And we found that native tone language listeners, including Mandarin and Cantonese listeners, they rely more on pitch relation cues However, Korean listeners, they're not native tone language listeners, they show greater variability in sensitivity to pitch cues, especially those with lower proficiency. We found a very interesting difference between Cantonese listeners and Korean listeners, although both of them are non-native listeners of Mandarin. Cantonese listeners, they show a broader low tone perception range, and we think that this may result from the perceptual assimilation of the mid-level tone into the low-level tone in their L1. On the other hand, Korean listeners, they showed a strong reliance on phonation cues, and we think that this may compensate for their relatively lower sensitivity to the pitch cue by adapting to a non-pitch feature of strong acoustic salience. But this shouldn't be too surprising because we know that the perception of speech sounds relies not only on intrinsic cues to those sounds, but also on cues coming from the acoustic properties of the environment. So I believe the novel contribution of our study is to further provide insight into the perceptual roles of cues, not intrinsic to the target tones in Mandarin, and their interaction with listeners' language experience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. The presentation is entitled Downtrend in Sylhetic Phrasal Tones, and you're welcome to start whenever you want.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from all the places in the world. Thank you for the chance to present our research on downtrend in Sylhetic phrasal tones. I understand that we are possibly at the end of a long day, and I'll try to share some interesting results here. If I try to give a brief background about downtrends, we understand that it refers to gradual lowering of F0 from the starting towards the end of utterances. So it includes basically three subtypes: declination, downstep, and final lowering. Although downtrend is deemed to be universal, however, in some of the tonal languages, it seems to be absent, and there is cross-linguistic variation in the nature and slope of the descending F0 contour. So before we move into the actual research questions, just a brief about the language that we are working on. It's Sylhetic, which is one of the Indo-Aryan language family. Please note that Sylhetic, Indo-Aryan languages in general are not known for their tonal characteristics. However, during my PhD dissertation, I actually established the two-way contrast in Sylhetic, and furthermore, we also showed that how those tones are also distinguished in terms of their phonation features. So one of the interesting feature in Sylhetic tone is the realization of tonal polarity, especially in the affixation processes, where the nominal affixes basically receives the tone opposite of the root. The affixes themselves are toneless. However, in case of verbal affixes, as we can see here, basically it seems like one of the slide is missing. Okay, in case of verbal affixes, basically what happens, they have their underlying high tone. Okay, in this case we can see actually here. So in case of some of the verbal affixes, they have their high tone, and then they force the high tone root to lower its or go to the opposite end of the lowering. So high tone becomes low, the low also remains low. So that's one of the interesting feature of Sylhetic tone. So moving ahead, so the research is primarily motivated. I don't know if I go for slide mode, it doesn't work, it seems. So I'm just like keeping it non-slide mode actually. So one of the uncommon combination of both lexical and the phrasal tone and tonality makes it like very interesting to explore further into the way intonation and lexical tone works, basically interacts when it comes to downtrend phenomena. So basically we are interested to look into how the overarching F0 downtrend across IPs shapes the surface realization of phrasal tones in this language, and how the resulting peak by peak descent can be mathematically and statistically modeled. As I already showed earlier. So basically, Sility prosodic structure, we identified 4 levels. These are prosodic word, accentual phrase, intermediate phrase, and international phrase. So the polarity thing that I was talking about, so these are 2 plural suffixes attached to 2 contrasting like root word in a bisyllabic pair. So body with a high tone, meaning heavy. Actually, we can see when the plural suffix is attached, it is actually realized with a falling tone, whereas like body home, which is otherwise a low tone, the root is a low tone, the plural suffix is actually realized with a raising F0. So our primary motivation to determine the prosodic word is that of the plurality rules that govern both derivational and inflectional affixes in Sility, based on the OCP parameter. So nominal suffixes that attach themselves to root, as I said, are underlyingly toneless. However, if we look at the like verbal suffixes, as I said already, mar, bit is a verb with a low underlying tone for the root, but the suffixes the suffix is maintains its higher tonal specification. So also for the verb thug, which is otherwise a high tone word, is realized with the low tone, and the suffix is actually realized with the higher tone. So moving into like the sentential structure, the phrasal tones, relative juncture, and boundary tones serve as the cue for marking intermediate and intonation phrases. So if we look into the sentence, Khala Mekurta Tar Bisnat Kumai, we can see that the AP is the lowest international unit, serving as the domain for L star pitch accent, followed by a HA AP boundary tone. So the sentence final AP is subject to a tonal overriding by the boundary tones, as we can see here. And the L star of the phrasal tone is always docked to the first syllable, while the H occurs at the phrase edges, as we can see here consistently. So AP is in sentence medial positions, serve as locations for an interesting interplay of lexical and intonational tones. So in the sentence by a, so the root, the root by actually is realized as a high tone word, but we can see like the start, and because of the polarity, it should have been a low tone, but it is not. But if we look there by a dan kiner, so dan is again a high tone word, and we can see the the lowering here, and kiner of course is realized with the fall tone. So international boundary tone is in interplay there. Same thing, by a jal kiner. So jal is the low tone word, and it is realized as a lower F0 compared to this dan. So it tried to actually maintain its underlying tonal specification, if as we can see in these 2 sentences. So these 2 sentences are different only in terms of the object word here. So in this case, the object word is basically a high tone word. Here it is a low tone word. Rest of the things are same, as we can see. So the prosodic structure actually prevents a complete obliteration of the underlying tones of the words. The resulting pitch contour for underlying H words exhibits a sharper rise compared to the L-toned words. Okay, if we move further, there is another sentence like where we gave a sort of a longer sentence. So driver eta zane ze amar baba master, and we can see like the underlying tonal specification is somehow tried to maintain, and then the phrasal accents are realized in these two sentences. He amar goro aibo আর ono ratikor থাকবো. He will come to our house and he will stay there for dinner. For this particular study to examine this downtrends phenomena in Sileti, we actually selected neutral declarative sentences. Those are divided into epies marked by an L-star pitch accent and HA boundary tones. To analyze the nature of downstep, the language, the peaks created by HA tones were investigated. While producing the data used for this study, the speakers tended to divide IPs into 2 or 3 epies. So we'll try to show the representations of each of the speakers in some of the sentences. And even though there were only 5 subjects in the preliminary study, we actually extend the study now, but then we are still showing the results of the 5 speaker here. We actually ensured that that the representation is really varied, and as well as sufficient number of data is there. So we actually did repetition method. So the entire questionnaire was repeated 5 times with considerable gaps in between, and we used of course Pratt to do initial segmentation, and later on we use prosody pro to denote the absurd related cues and redraw the structures using Python and R. So if we look into the figures, so these are different sentences produced by all the 5 speakers. So each speaker's data is, I'm sorry, I'm not able to show you the bigger slide. I don't know why the slide mode doesn't work. If I move into the slide mode, I can see it doesn't work actually. So anyway, just to save time, I'm not trying to play with it. So we can see the speaker 1 is represented with the black color, a red represents speaker 2, speaker 3 is blue, speaker 4 is blue, speaker 3 is green, and magenta is speaker 5. So these are 5 different speakers, and obviously speaker 1 and 3 are male, and then the remaining are female speakers basically. So we can also understand this based on their absurd cues. I'm sorry I did not write the gender issues there, the gender information there. So we can see that each speaker maintains the characteristic pitch patterns of repeated epies regardless of sentence length. So we kept on increasing the sentence length. For example, in the first sentence, we can see Baye bat ar mas baza khai versus Baye mas baza ar dal balafai. So here we have added 2 to 3 more syllables, basically monosyllabic words here, and we can still see the peaks are maintained across the subject. So here pujai ekta lal jama kinse. So when we are increasing the number of syllables, or we are changing the underlying underlying tonal specification of the root words, we can see a peak is going on. So the first peak is often the highest across all speaker, as we can see, this is the highest peak, in most of the cases except for this speaker possibly. Here it is somehow maintained, that is speaker number 4, followed by subsequent peaks, and that tend to decrease in height, like steps and going down. It is to be noted that the underlying lexical tones do not impact the F0 peaks, as the change the scaling of the L star pitch accents influencing the interpolating lines. So if we just try to understand the phonological nature of this downstep of F0 peak sensibility, we see that the constant and predictable rate of change in F0 serves as motivation, as it was given by, it was like, observed by Lieberman and Priambert. So here we tried to calculate the downstep ratio by using this formula where Px represents the peak height at a particular position, let's say first height, first peak, second peak, third peak, etc. And then the reference line is calculated by, like, the mean F0 of the last peak, the previous peak, plus combination of the mean F0 minimum divided by 2. So this is the formula we used to calculate these things. And then the F0 height of any given peak can be calculated or predicted as a constant fraction of the previous peak's height. Just to refer back, like this formula we actually used, like, as it was suggested in Lieberman and Priambert's study. This is something that we introduced as a mathematical calculation. So we tried to examine the predicted F0 trend that we can compare with the original ones to understand how these peaks take shape in the actual sentences. So the downstep ratio, that is basically the second peak to the first peak, is found to be plus minus 0.69 actually. That is represented the average value of the standard deviation. The ratio remains consistent, indicating a stable relationship between consecutive peaks. So between first peak to second peak to the third peak, so the ratio is almost similar regardless of the temporal location of the second peak. So this is the the model that we are proposing here. So we have the linear fit here and the exponential decay here, and then the adoption of the Lieberman and Priambert's model in figure 3. So we can see like the actual representations of peak when you have a longer word. So each peak actually maintains where first peak is the highest one, and gradual declination is maintained throughout the epi's there. It is widely observed across many languages that the final peak in the F0 contour exhibits a more pronounced F0 descent, and which indicates that the F0 value of the last peak cannot be modeled using the same downstep ratio applied to non-final peaks, and that's why we are proposing an additional modeling there. Now, if we try to adopt this formula, P to the x plus 2, that is the predicted one, is equal to r plus 1 star multiplied with p x plus 1 minus r, where p x plus 2 is the predicted in the predicted F0 contour. If you can see the way they move, actually the exponential decay and then the linear fit there, and r is the reference line. So if we look into this, so this is basically the reference line and then the way they are distributed basically, and one is the final lowering constant. So comparison of predicted and observed F0 values for a given peak is shown here. In one, the predicted F0 values are calculated using the downstep ratio R, where in two, they are based on the final lowering constant, basically the n, if we look at the original figures here. The dotted lines represents the regression lines, and the R-square values are displayed to indicate the fit quality. So we can see like these are all good fit basically. Now, from this study, we understood that the underlying lexical tones sensibility do not directly affect the F0 peaks of the phrasal tones. The scaling changes induced by IP medial high tone roots do not modify the phonological specification of the phrasal tones. They only affect the vertical positioning of the pitch trajectory between low and high tone. If we again look into this word, for example, pujai ekta lal jama kinse, or here baye bath. So this should have been also again high, or mas baza, again khai. So we can see, like, even though there are like, consistently heightened words, each are reflected with, consecutive higher peaks there. By mas baza balafai, so pi is like the low tone, mas by mas baza bala, so all are high tone peak, and then each of them are realized with consecutive peaks there. So these findings reinforce the idea that the observed downtrend is not a byproduct of articulatory or phonetic processes. Rather, it is phonologically governed international feature. So we propose two modeling here. One is based on the downstep ratio and using the final lowering constant proposed by Lieberman and Brambert. The final lowering constant model be more accurate, achieving a strong correlation between predicted and observed peak values. So the study demonstrated that F0 downtrend in Sileti neutral declarative is phonological. Despite being a tonal language, Sileti employs phrasal tones whose surface realization follow predictable, mathematically modelable downstep patterns, showcasing a broader typological understanding of how lexical tone and international tone systems can interact within a single language. Thank you. Should you require further discussion, or if you want me to share the slide, please, you can email me at amoleshetteju@sc.in. Thank you.
Thank you all for your contributions today and for the work you put into making this session valuable. We also appreciate your patience with the technical issue. These things happen. Your understanding made it much more easier to manage. On behalf of the International Linguistic Society, thank you once again, and we look forward to continuing our collaboration, says Katie. And I'll just want to say from me as well, thank you to all the presenters and to all the organizers for today. We did have some hang-ups, especially early on, but I think it turned out quite okay anyway. And I'm happy that at the very least, everyone got to kind of give their presentations. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And wish you a lovely rest of your day. And see you all soon.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.